This next story about extreme metal and true crime hits really close to home for me, considering the fact that I started getting into more forms of extreme metal and underground extreme metal towards the end of 2014, roughly around the same time when I started this YouTube channel. And the events with the band, or really in this case one of the band members in question here, happened a year later towards the end of 2015, showcasing to me at a really early point with me getting invested with the whole subculture and scene of extreme metal, that all different forms of real world evil and horror can happen in all different corners of this world. This all being about Goatlord, or more particularly the guitarist of Goatlord, Joe Frankulin. Before we get into the details of Joe Frankulin, it's important to understand the history of the band that he was in as a guitar player, that being Goatlord. For those who are unaware, Goatlord was a four-piece death doom metal band from Las Vegas, Nevada, that formed back in the year 1985 and is widely considered to be one of, if not the very first extreme metal band to blend forms together of both doom metal and death metal together, otherwise known as Death Doom. Their first release was a demo simply titled Demo 1987. As I stated a second ago, Goatlord is widely considered to be the first ever extreme metal band to play together both death metal and doom metal. And with this 1987 demo right here, it's widely considered by many accounts this is the first release of that style of music being put on tape. It's only 4 tracks and it clocks in roughly around 15 minutes long, and there's really not much to say about this demo other than the historical context that it's death doom, because it's very lo-fi, very grainy, and everything about this is just harsh. However, with the riffs and tempo that you can keep pace with, it's just really heavy but slow forms of death metal and doom metal being played simultaneously that almost has somewhat of a black metal edge to it, and that mainly has to do with the fact of just how raw it is, and some of the vocal performances on here mirrors that in retrospect anyway to how we view black metal. But this would be the beginnings for Goatlord. A year later, in 1988, they would release a follow-up demo called Sodomize the Goat. A much lengthier release, because even though it's labeled as a demo, the overall runtime for it is 70 minutes long, as they really expand upon the songwriting and dynamics with it. Case in point, one of the tracks on here called Twilight Rem clocks in a little over 10 minutes long, which is 2/3 the length of their previous demo altogether. As for the production value, it's nowhere as grainy as the previous demo, showcasing they put a bit more time and finances into it. As for the songwriting, as I stated, definitely more expanded upon, as it's a mixture again of the hybrid of death doom. There's portions on it where it gets really fast and thrashy with some of the drumming on here that reminiscence to that of 80s and late 80s death metal, as other portions on it slow down and get a bit hazy to give off the sounds of doom metal, both bouncing off of each other, that the dynamics are simple but really straightforward and primitive. Only other thing to point out here that I've noticed is when it comes to the vocal performance on really just all Goatlord releases, especially the demo and the full length, is that some people label Goatlord as a black metal band as well, or black death doom, a mixture of all three of those subgenres because of how they snarl and shriek at certain points. And I do feel like in retrospect we can kind of connect it to black metal because of how harsh it is. But just again, to save my breath here, I'm just going to call Goatlord a death doom band. Of the dozen tracks that are featured on their 1988 demo, Sodomize the Goat, 3 years later in 1991, 8 of those tracks would be put on to their debut full-length album, Reflections of the Solstice. Even though this full-length album has all the material from their previous demos, over 30 years later, it's still highly celebrated among the Goatlord fans and fans of death doom metal, because in retrospect, when you look at all of the bells and whistles and components featured on this album, there's a lot going for it, both in terms of the music, the songwriting, the mixing and mastering, and even the visuals of it. Thanks to them actually being signed to a label and not releasing it independently, they were able to get more finances and resources for it. The label they were signed to at this point was Turbo Music, a German label that at this time period in the late 80s and early 90s was specializing in releasing albums in vein of black metal, death metal, and doom metal. Case in point, at this time, Beherit was signed to this label, and this is when they were releasing their album, An Oath of Black Blood. So clearly the same vision was being mirrored here with this Goatlord record, at least when it comes to the dynamics and overall sound. Another surprising feature about this album, at least now in retrospect, is that Mitch Harris is featured on this album on tracks as Underground Church, Acid Orgy, and Sacrifice. As at this point now he just started, but as of today he still is the guitarist and does secondary vocals for the legendary grindcore band Napalm Death. And on top of it, the album artwork is done by Chris Moyen, a French artist who has done artwork for just too many extreme metal bands to name that his resume stretches back decades. Again, another legendary figure in some cases when it at least comes to album artwork for extreme metal. Overall, when you look at the album artwork, production value, and listen to the album itself, it's the total package for anyone who wants aggressive, primitive, early death doom that I would argue for this niche little subgenre of music, it's an absolute essential. A year later in 1992, Goatlord would re-release the album Reflections of Solstice, but now it would be the American release of it, as it would have a different album name, it being self-titled. The album artwork is different, it sounds a bit different as it was produced in a different studio, and the real big shakeup here is there's an additional track on it, that being Voodoo Mass. But again, this is still in vein of Death Doom. And then after that, nothing really came of Goatlord. They would remain active for 5 years after and disband in 1997. Really all that I can find that they really did between them time periods is they would be active performing live shows, one of which being archived here on YouTube, of a performance they did in 1993 in Arizona, which a link provided in the description to it if you want to watch it in full. What I found really odd about the disbanding of Goatlord is that unlike most bands when they disband, all the musicians of those bands continue on their endeavors with other projects or start other bands. However, with Goatlord, besides the drummer Jeff Nardon, who continued on drumming with a different band called Spun in Darkness, all the other members of Goatlord just didn't do anything. Now, even though Goatlord is disbanded and they're not making music anymore, their band name and releases are still being licensed under different labels, because in 2003 there would be a compilation put out of all of their demos from Beyond Productions. Then a year later in 2004, Bestial Onslaught would release a split between Goatlord and Nunslaughter. Once again, the material by Goatlord is from previous demos and releases. But I would say their biggest release that they put out after they disbanded would be in 2007, put out through Nuclear War Now, that being their compilation called The Last Sodomy of Mary. The reason why I put air quotes over compilation is that technically what this is, it's a compilation of rehearsals that was going to be Goatlord's second full-length album. It's comprised of all new material, at least to the fans anyway, that were unaware of these rehearsals that were recorded. And really what this compilation slash second full-length album is by Goatlord, it's still in vein of that death doom approach that they did before. However, the doom metal aspect is toned back a bit in favor now of a black metal sound that really what it reminds me of is more of a black death approach, and similar to that of something like Black Witchery, only with the doom metal influence by Goatlord at times. It sounds like Black Witchery, but just the one notch back in terms of speed and aggression. But for Goatlord anyway, this is easily their most aggressive and fastest material that they would release. Talking about the past 3 releases of Goatlord albums after they disbanded is quite important, because it clearly showcased that there was still an interest and a market for Goatlord merchandise and material as it was being purchased and clearly put out by different labels and fans. And I think it's a huge reason as to why Goatlord was planning on reforming and doing a reunion show. Apparently, Goatlord was planning on doing a reunion show in 2014 in Germany at one of the Nuclear War Now festivals. It's just what prevented them from doing that is one of the members of Goatlord, I believe the drummer, was afraid of flying, which prevented them not only from reforming, but also just performing at that festival altogether. This would end up being confirmed by Joe Frankulin himself on his personal Facebook, as he states, "Some of you might have heard that I've been trying to get a Goatlord reunion happening to play at the Nuclear War Now festival in Germany. Sadly, that looks like it is not going to happen. As much as I tried, I couldn't get Jeff Nardon and Ace Still to agree to it. Apparently, Jeff Nardon is afraid of flying." Yes, that's right. The reason that is preventing Goatlord from reuniting again and to play in Germany is because the drummer is afraid of flying. Sorry everyone, I apologize for this. I stated towards the beginning of this video, in order to understand Joe Frankulin, it's important to understand the history and demise of Goatlord, as I personally believe the outcome for Goatlord is one of the many key components that led to the really tragic downfall for Joe Frankulin. I'll explain why that is in greater detail later on in this video. But for the time being, we now need to focus with Joe Frankulin in his own personal life in the mid-2010s, more specifically around the time period of 2014 and 2015. At this point, Joe Frankulin is still living in Las Vegas, Nevada in his mom's house. However, she ended up passing away in the year 2007, leaving Joe Frankulin all alone in that house from the years of 2007 to 2015. One of the reports that I came across from the Las Vegas Review-Journal is that neighbors described Joe Frankulin that he always came to them stating that he was broke, often noticing that he was selling a lot of his own personal possessions in yard sales and to pawn shops. In order to keep himself busy, along with becoming financially stable, people around the neighborhood would get Joe work, whether it be mowing the lawn to other forms of yard work in the neighborhood. He would also make bike ramps for the kids in the neighborhood outside of his own personal garage. Since he was spending his free time creating bike ramps for children, he would always be in proximity to the local kids of the neighborhood, which, as one can imagine, would really sketch out the parents of those children. Seeing a 47-year-old who's mainly always dressed in dirty clothing with a really heavy set to your 8 or 10-year-old can be kind of sketchy and off-putting for the adults witnessing that. Hence why, as time went on, Joe Frankulin would find himself being visited by children less and less when he was working outside of his garage. Which, as time continued on, there was even more eyewitness reports stating that Joe became even weirder in terms of interaction, even coming off a bit skittish with how he would talk and move. There was other witness reports as well that during some of the late hours in the night, they would see Joe just digging randomly dirt holes in the front yard of his house. To put it blunt, Joe's mental and emotional health was deteriorating rapidly in front of everyone in the neighborhood. One such case was on September 25th, 2015. Police would show up at Joe's house, stating that one of his friends was concerned for his health as he was showcasing signs of suicidal thoughts. Apparently, on that day when police showed up to his house, he ended up being really cooperative and even handed the gun to the police that he was planning on ending his life with. Even though residents in the surrounding neighborhood were wary of Joe as he always came off suspicious, police couldn't do anything about it, as they really can't arrest a person because people have a hunch that they are bad or suspicious. So really nothing came of that incident on September 25th. A few days later, eyewitness reports stated that they started noticing Joe was barricading his house with street signs, debris, and other forms of garbage. A day or two after, in the morning of October 2nd, 2015, gunshots would be heard all around the neighborhood. It's unclear as to how this altercation started, but Joe Frankulin would end up grabbing his shotgun and shooting his next door neighbor, Jennifer Donoso, right in front of her house. Of the reports I read, Jennifer Donoso was a 39-year-old, sweet, caring individual and a mother of 3 children. Of the 3 children, her daughter witnessed the event take place. Her daughter ended up screaming, running away to the nearest neighbor, shouting that her mother had been shot. And within minutes, police ended up arriving to the scene. In the short time period it took for police to arrive to the scene, Joe ended up kidnapping one of Jennifer's children, that being her 8-year-old son, Lexus Donoso. Given the dire situation, police tried negotiating and even getting a SWAT team involved. But it was too little, too late, as what they ended up hearing was 2 shots being fired. Those shots being for Lexus Donoso by Joe, and shortly after, Joe Frankulin would end up taking his own life. When police arrived to the scene, they noticed that the house was completely boarded up, and on the garage door it was spray painted the words, "I love you, baby." When they entered the household, they located the bodies of both Lexus and Joe, and also noticed that there was trash and garbage in the overall house in just complete disarray, as if it hadn't been cleaned up in months. Before I go any further with the story, obviously connecting it to mental health and Joe Frankulin's headspace just going to complete insanity in an incredibly violent way, back in 2015, I remember hearing about this story being totally off guard, and it surprised a lot of people. And even today, 10 years later after this event, people still talk about it as it's some of the most heinous, barbaric, tragic events to be related to something of that of extreme metal and true crime here. My heart still goes out to the victims of this case, because it's bad enough that it's a murder case out of all things, but for it to involve an 8-year-old boy, it's a whole new level of tragic and a whole new level and form of despicable. But getting back on track here with the story, from all the reports I've read, it would always end with police are trying to find a motive as to why Joe Frankulin would do this, when I don't think there is one particular motive, but more so it's a combination of all different events or connections we could put to Joe as to what really just broke him mentally. Besides everything I addressed in this video that I'll summarize in a bit, another key component that people connect with Joe Frankulin's deteriorated mental state is that apparently he was also an administrator for something called blood shows, one of the many things that would go on in this website called rotten.com, otherwise known as a snuff website. The last update for that website was back in 2012 and was archived with the last homepage update back in 2018. But as I stated, rotten.com was a snuff, gore type of website that would always showcase images of crime scenes, whether it was to do with terrorism, to beheading. Basically what it was essentially the movie Faces of Death or Traces of Death, that type of content, but just on a website all the time. And for someone like Joe to be an administrator of that kind of stuff, seeing it on a regular basis, you don't have to be a therapist to know that that would really mess up someone's mental state, seeing such explicit content daily. As for his involvement with Goatlord, you notice the whole time that he was a part of Goatlord, there was never any forms of mental health outbreaks, I guess, with his overall attitude. He didn't have a police record. He seemed really stable of a person. It seemed like Goatlord, when he was active with those band members, gave him a sense of purpose. Even after they disbanded, he was still having ways of finding deals with record labels to re-release their music or put out compilations of demos from the past. And it seemed like he was really eager to get Goatlord to reform again in 2014, but when that didn't end up happening, in that Facebook post I showcased earlier on in this video, it almost seemed like he had a strong resentment for just his band members not really committing to it like he did. So really the importance with Goatlord here is it gave him a sense of purpose and just stability mentally and emotionally, it seemed. As for his own personal life, his mother passing away in 2007, him living by himself all those years, the neighborhood having a strong resentment for how he looked and acted and what he did in his free time, it seemed like he didn't have anything that he could gravitate to find purpose or just someone to relate with him. And I think this solitude really started messing with him. All in all, I think those are the big key reasons as to what led to his mental breakdown and downfall. Regardless of what else we can add to this as to why it is, or there's some unwritten event that caused him to truly snap, it doesn't justify, even for a brief moment, the heinous acts that he committed. Because again, this whole crime scene is just absolutely vile in the most insane, despicable ways possible, and I can't emphasize that enough. Now, one thing I've noticed whenever the conversation is brought up about Goatlord all these years later is people often wonder if it's wrong to enjoy Goatlord, to buy their music, to listen to it, or even state that it's an essential when it comes to Death Doom, mainly having to do with everything that Joe Frankulin did. And I understand that. However, Goatlord's work and material was not just Joe. There was other members involved with it. All the music that they wrote and released and performed happened decades before this incident happened. So I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying Goatlord or buying one of their reissues from Nuclear War Now. And yes, even after everything I talked about, I would still state that when it comes to death doom metal, Goatlord still is an absolute essential if you want to get into this style of music. The last thing that I can add here relating to Joe Frankulin is apparently he had his own YouTube channel called Goat Metal. Of the videos he uploaded, most of it is live footage of Goatlord shows. However, the last video he would ever upload on that channel was uploaded a little over 10 years ago, called Best Phone Prank Ever, number 2. According to the info of this video, along with the intro of it, it states that they were prank calling one of the cab driver companies, stating that they were kidnapped by the cab driver and they won't let them go. And it also states that it's one of his acquaintances that did this prank call. However, for all we know, it could have been Joe himself who did this prank call, and he's using it as coverage. That way he doesn't get in trouble for it. Because if you listen to this video, and it only plays a little over 5 minutes long, it always just seems so urgent and serious on the cab company's end. Whereas whoever is calling them seems to just be genuinely trying to pull their leg. It's just really eerie and disturbing when you add it to the context of what YouTube channel this is connected to. That, I don't know, it just genuinely turned my blood cold hearing this for some reason. It really sent shivers down my spine. But yeah, other than that, that's the only other bit of information that I can tell you guys about Joe. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If there's any other true crime stories that you want to hear me talk about on this channel, definitely let me know in the comments. And like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.